Throughout our 120 years, Ford has supported our nation's armed forces and honored their selfless service to our country. The Central Ohio Ford dealers are proud to continue this tradition by investing in the work of the National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus. Together, we want to share the veterans' heroic stories and introduce a grateful nation to the faces behind our forces. Please join us monthly to hear inspiring educational stories from our veterans who have gone above and beyond their call to defend freedom around the world. The National Veterans Memorial and Museum and your Central Ohio Ford dealers. Together, we will never forget.
Well, hello and welcome to our September Inspiring Story of Service. Today, in honor of National POW MIA Recognition Day, we have U.S. Army veteran Paul Arcangeli joining us to share his story. Paul was a commander of the Army's 176th Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit in Alaska from 1992 to 1995, and he deployed to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. During his service, Paul supported Joint Task Force Full Accounting on several MIA search and recovery missions in Southeast Asia. After his transition from the Army, Paul continued to serve by working on the U.S. House of Representatives Armed Services Committee for nearly 18 years. Today, Paul works as a commissioner for the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology and is also the principal of Invariant GR, a bipartisan government relations and public affairs firm. So before we discuss your Joint Task Force Full Accounting work, if you can just tell us a little bit about your service and why you were inspired to join the Army, Paul.
Sure. So I wanted to be in the Army from the time I was 6 years old. My father served in World War II, and then he was a missile engineer for the Army in Huntsville, Alabama. And it was the thing I wanted to do from the time I was just a tiny kid. And I went to a military high school, and then I went to a military college. I went to North Georgia College, and then I was in the Army, and that was the best thing. I loved my Army service, and it was really what I had wanted to do, and I enjoyed it so much. And I would have kept doing it. I was medically retired after 13 years, but it was the thing that I loved the most.
Okay, so then you're in ROTC at North Georgia, and you're presented with what branch do you want to be? How did you make the decision to go into engineers and then explosive ordnance?
So I wasn't an engineer. I was an ordnance officer, and there's always that tension between engineers and EOD officers. But I had enlisted in the Guard and had been in the infantry in the Guard, and there was a lot of pressure that they wanted me to go and join the infantry. But I really wanted to be an EOD officer. I'd heard about it. I'd seen it. I thought it was what a neat job to be able to go out and defuse bombs and lead soldiers to do it. And, that was just an exciting opportunity. And the hard thing was I had to go and be a maintenance ordnance officer first. So I spent 3.5 years as a maintenance ordnance officer, something I didn't want to do, to get to the opportunity to go to EOD school and then move on to be an EOD commander.
So then you go to probably the advanced course back then, and then you go to EOD school or vice versa. But you find yourself up in Alaska as the commander of an explosive ordnance detachment. So tell us a little bit about that and the mission that y'all had in Alaska, what you did, and then we'll get into the JTF full accounting piece.
Sure. So the 176 was the Army EOD unit for all of Alaska. So we covered the entire state. And we used to say, cut Alaska in half and make Texas the third largest state. So we had a lot of ground to cover. Right. We were responsible for all the military ordnance that required render safe, commercial ordnance that was found, explosives that were found. And we were on call for all of the public safety offices in the state because there wasn't another EOD unit or civilian bomb disposal unit in the state at the time. So we covered a whole lot of ground. And people would say, well, how many explosives are there in Alaska? There's a lot. There's a lot of explosives. They fought the war in the World War II. It was fought on the Aleutians. So there's leftover Japanese explosives. They have trained in Alaska for 70 years now, and there's a lot of dud munitions that have been fired, and they had ranges in all kinds of places in Alaska that are no longer ranges.
Mhm.
And then the found explosive problem was constant. So we were busy with that. We did a lot of missions in Alaska.
So then you've also got the mission to support JTF full accounting. Was that a full-time mission, or was that just a on-call mission as situations arose where explosives were found? How'd that work?
So the unit was small. It's when I got there, there were 10 soldiers in the unit. It was
Oh, wow.
it was a detachment, and it grew over the 3 years I was there to about 18 people.
Okay.
And we had a continuous presence with the JTFFA. They would draw teams from Hawaii and from Alaska, from the two EOD units, and we maintained about 3 soldiers in Southeast Asia continuously over my 3 years. So at least 3, sometimes 6 of my soldiers would be deployed. And when they would deploy for 45 to 60 days with the JTFFA.
How many missions did you go on?
I did 3 in the course of my 3 years, and they were all the Christmas missions. So I would take the duty that went over the holidays.
That's great.
To make it a little easier on everybody else.
And then did you do one mission to Vietnam, one to Laos, one to Cambodia, just by happenstance? And then can you describe those missions? You know, who was found, what you're looking for, and then your participation in it.
Sure. So I can't talk about who was found. That was the one thing that we would never were never allowed to discuss, was the names of the people that we were looking for.
Okay.
But the rest of the story I can talk about. And back in the 90s, we were still in the beginning of, in the middle of the search. You know, there were a lot of cases at the start, and you would go into the country, any of the 3 countries, and you would be assigned to one of 2 kinds of teams, either a recovery element or an investigation team. Investigation teams would be given 20 or 25 cases, and the JTF full-time folks would do the research and be prepared to go to different locations to investigate each of those missions, each of those cases. And then the recovery teams would be given 1, 2, or 3 cases that had already been investigated by an investigation team and were prepared to then go and do a dig or some kind of recovery to try and see if they could recover remains. These teams sometimes generally would go out together. So you might have 1 investigation team and 2 recovery elements that would go into Vietnam or Cambodia and Laos. And so it'd be 16 to people, maybe 20 people who would be out there. You would be on a team. I'd spend a lot of my time on the investigation teams. They would be a team leader who would be an Army Special Forces captain. There would be a Special Forces medic. We would have some linguists, some military linguists. We'd have some military, like aircraft equipment specialists who would come with us because they could pick up any piece of metal and say, yeah, that's the buckle from a ACES II ejection seat, and you needed to know that because that kind of information could tell you what kind of aircraft you were looking at on this crash site, because you didn't always know if you were looking at the right crash site. And 2, did the pilot go in with the plane? Did the pilot eject?
Right.
If we don't find any ejection seat parts, then we would know maybe the ejection seat went out of the aircraft, and the aircraft that we're looking at, we're not going to find any remains. So that would be an investigation team. The recovery elements had an archaeologist or someone trained in essentially how to do an archaeological dig. And they came out of JTF. And then they would also have linguists and other people who would work on those sites. And the two were very wildly different. The recovery elements would go into the site that had already been prepped, and they would treat it like an archaeological dig. They would lay strings on the ground. They would grid the area. They would bring screens. They would clear it of munitions and explosives, and then they would dig, and they would screen all the things that they would dig, and they're looking for remains. The investigation teams were much more far-ranging. We would move by helicopter often. We would, depending on the country, we might move by ground vehicles, but in Laos, it was all by helicopter. In Cambodia, by helicopter. We moved to different areas in the provinces that we were in. I spent a lot of time in the Pleiku area and also in the border area in Vietnam. I also spent time on the other side of the border in Vietnam, Cambodia. These trips were, each one was different. If you did 20 cases in Vietnam, you would see a wide range of different situations. Some would be aircraft crashes. Some would be soldiers who went missing in different locations. And some would be prisoner of war camps where potentially POWs who had died in the captivity may have been buried in locations. So a bunch of different possibilities. And we would go and we would talk to people on the ground. We would connect up through our Vietnamese counterparts with potential witnesses who could help us locate the crash, locate potentially where remains would be, or tell us the story about what may have happened and transpired around the cases. These are the investigation teams, in my opinion, were, I moved around a lot. The recovery elements was much more difficult. And I worked on some of those for some of my time. And you dug and you shook dirt and you looked for remains. And you were looking for a lot of different things all the time, working in 100-degree heat, all the hazards of Southeast Asian jungle, leeches and snakes and all of that. And you're working generally on crash sites. And the thing I can say about that is there are a lot of explosive hazards with crash sites. And in addition to that, there were also hazards that were laid after. So there might be landmines, there might be dropped bombs, there might be submunitions. So there was a lot of things that were going on those recovery elements. And it was backbreaking work because people were hunched over screens all day, every day, looking for remains. And then if you might be in a field camp, so you might spend the entire 60 days living in a tent in Laos on a riverbank, or you might spend it in some other accommodation. If you were in Vietnam or you were in someplace near a more built up area, you might actually sleep in a bed. The thing that I would say is different from 1992 and 1993 and now is when I would deploy soldiers into those countries, or I would go, when you went, you were cut off from the world. You disappeared. We had an HF radio, and we would make one call a day back to the headquarters in Hanoi. And we'd give them a situation report, like everybody's okay, and we got all our sensitive items. And that was it. And there was no mail, there was no phone calls, there was no email. And so, no news was good news to family back home. Yeah, but those missions really took a toll because we were all rotating all the time into those countries.
Is there one mission that either you participated in or somebody from your detachment that sticks out as either incredibly challenging, or you struck gold and you found, 2 or 3 remains that were missing or something like that?
There are a couple things. I worked on a screen on a couple of occasions, and you're going through buckets of dirt and you're shaking them out, and it's a 2-man screen, and each shake, you're trying to see what you're going to find. And you might find a lot of rocks. Every now and then you might be, if you're an EOD guy, you get excited when you find a hand grenade. But also you're looking for bones, and you're looking for teeth, and you're looking for change from somebody's pocket. You're looking for watch bands. because you're trying to find out, did people go in with the crash? Did they get out of the plane? Because sometimes we didn't know. And to be hunched over a screen for 6 hours and not find anything is discouraging. To be hunched over a screen after 6 hours and find a tooth is both encouraging and discouraging. It's just an awful thing to say, okay, I found this. I'm glad I found it.
Right.
But it means somebody died in the plane. And so it's kind of conflicting. The mission that really sticks in my head was one where we didn't find any remains. We were in Vietnam on the border with Cambodia. We connected with the local Viet Cong commander who had been the Viet Cong commander, and we described two service members, two special forces soldiers who had been dropped into this area and were trying to get to a North Vietnamese camp, a South Vietnamese camp nearby. The Viet Cong identified them very quickly when they were on the ground and gave chase. And this older gentleman, a fascinating older man, led us on a walk of 15 kilometers through the jungle and described their uniforms, the time of year. Mm-hmm. He told us, this is where we, shot the first one. This is where, the second one fired back and killed two of my men. And he told us the story that took us all through the circle in the jungle. And they were both killed by the Viet Cong and buried in the jungle. And he took us to a place that says, this is where we buried their body. Well, this is 100 by 100 area of jungle, of 100 by 100 meter area of jungle. And you're not going to find anything. We went through and we did the best we could, but we were able to tell a story about two people who fell off the face of the earth in 1968. Right. We could tell their families. We know definitively what happened to them, where before they just disappeared.
Right. Yeah, I would imagine being a participant on those recovery missions, that it's incredibly rewarding. A couple of years ago, they found and had identified remains of a Merrill's Marauder in India, or Nepal, I guess. And they identified, returned those back to the families. So there's a group of us that went down from Columbus down to southern Ohio and went to the funeral. And he still had a niece who was alive, and she was in her late 80s. And for that family, it was, priceless opportunity. She found her long lost uncle. And if you ever question whether or not communities appreciate military service, that whole community came out, hundreds and hundreds of people, standing room only in the chapel that they had in town. And it was about a 13-mile drive or ride from the chapel to the family plot. And, of course, all through the town along the Ohio River, hundreds of flags, hundreds of people out clapping and, waving flags sort of thing. And then when you got into the country, every house or business that we passed, the occupants, whether they were business owners or just owners of the homes and families, were out waving flags. You talk about, just a moving moment to watch that and watch, thousands of people come out for somebody that none of them knew.
What an investment was made, right? In not just in money, but in, we put a lot of people at risk to go and do that. And we had injuries and we had deaths because of aircraft crashes. And it was a commitment to bring them back. And it was difficult when we had cases where we're never going to find the body.
Right.
And I know that it hurt because I knew that there's no way to make that right with a family. Mm-hmm. But to stand on the ground and go, we're not going to find anything is, right. At least we know we tried and we did everything we could to get to those places. And sometimes getting to the places was really hard. Oh, yeah. One particular case, we landed in Laos on a sandbank and spent all day climbing a mountain. We got up the mountain. Our Laotian guide, kept saying just a little further, and it was not a little further. It was a lot further. And we had to cut a landing zone. We didn't have radios. We weren't allowed to have radios. And so, we cut a landing zone at the top of this mountain so that the helicopter could come back and pick us up before dark. And I remember waving a high vis panel to try and get his attention before the sun went down. And he picked us up. The next day, we flew into that landing zone. He dropped us off, and we hiked again all day. And we found a crash site. We found a helicopter up at the top of the mountain, and it was mostly intact.
Oh,
it was incredible. In the jungle, stuck between trees, half burned. We took the numbers off the engine. It was the wrong crash. We knew.
Oh, wow.
So that's the kind of effort that we made to try and find. And sometimes you found nothing. But every day you get up and you do it again and try and get to the place where they might be.
So that particular crash site, was that one that had already been found, or there were no remains suspected to be there, or
operational loss?
Okay.
And that they had recovered all of the people during Vietnam. We just didn't know it was that. I'll tell you, there are a lot of crash sites, and there are pieces of aircraft that show up everywhere. You'd walk through, go to a village to talk to people and ask about a crash site, and they'd say, "Oh yeah," and then they take you around the back of the house, and there on the back of the house is the wing of an A1.
Yeah.
Or you'd ask them, "Where is the crash site?" And they take you up to a crash site. And crash sites are funny. After 25 years or 20 years, they don't look like a plane crash site. There might be propellers sticking out of the ground. Mm-hmm. There might be pieces of aircraft, but most of the time it was all broken up. And the thing that was left was the bombs, the 2.75 inch rockets. Mm-hmm. And they would be rotted apart, and you just find the warheads or the submunitions that were dropped. The submunitions that were dropped either were rode in with the aircraft or were dropped after the fact because we didn't want the Viet Cong to go after the munitions on the airplane. So that's how you locate these crash sites, was mostly by the munitions that were left still intact on the site.
Now, how many missions and recovery operations did you guys have to blow something up to make it safe to then get the archaeological team and the investigative team or the recovery team in there to actually do their work?
So bomb disposal, EOD work is, you're supposed to, not make things blow up, but a lot of ways we make things go away as we blow them up.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the Vietnamese and Laotians wouldn't allow us to use explosives in their country. That changed a little bit in some places, but you went out with your, Leatherman. In Cambodia, we were given some explosives. We were allowed to use explosives, and we did if necessary. But usually what we'd be forced to do is figure out, you look at it and say, can I move that? Is that something that's safe to move? Or do we just need to work around it? And in some cases, you could look at it and say, yeah, that's a BLU-3 Bravo submunition that has not been deployed. I can pick that up and move that. In some cases, you would look at things and say, that's 100-pound white phosphorus bomb, and the fuse is not visible to me. I don't think we're going to mess with that.
Right.
So we had, you kind of had to do magic sometimes to move things. And there were, in some cases, I found landmines that had been laid by the Viet Cong after the crash, and they were still on the crash site. Some of these crash sites were on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a highly mined area. And there were a couple of occasions where I was near the trail and said, this whole area is a minefield. So I think there was a lot of luck for us. I'm surprised that a lot more people didn't get injured because of just how much opportunity to be hurt there was. It's one thing to pick leeches off your body all day, every day. It's another thing to have to deal with landmines, snakes, and questionable aircraft being flown by Laotian pilots that,
Just shifting gears a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about your house or your work with the Armed Services Committee at the House?
Sure. So after I was medically retired from the Army, I worked briefly for the Department of Defense. And that work was as the head of the Department of Defense Humanitarian Demining Training Center. And I ended up in landmine work, mostly because of my time in Southeast Asia. I was really moved by the fact that there was such a huge unexploded ordnance problem in those countries. And it really drove me to try and get involved in that work. And that's how I ended up there. I did that for a few years, and then I ended up on Capitol Hill, where I worked for 18 years with the House Armed Services Committee. I did several years as the lead for Readiness for the Readiness Subcommittee, and then I was the staff director for 12 years with the committee. And that is an extension of my military service. Sometimes I like to say I
would imagine so.
I was still deeply involved in national security and defense issues. I worked with people that cared greatly about national security and defense issues, and regardless of party, they worked hard. They didn't get paid well. I used to say, my work approximates my military service. I just don't eat off a paper plate in the rain, and nobody shoots at me now. But other than that, it was very similar. The hours were bad, and everybody was pulling, on the oars to try and make certain that we could provide a National Defense Authorization Act every year and give guidance and oversight to the department to help them through. And I arrived in 2004 to the committee, which was a pretty tough time for the Department of Defense and the services as they fought through Afghanistan and also Iraq. And I would come in every morning and turn on my computer, and the first thing I would do is look at the casualty roll to see if I saw my friends.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So I was not wearing a uniform, and it was hard for me.
Oh, yeah. I would imagine so.
And so, that I felt that was an extension of my service in a way that I could still serve. And I stayed with the committee until 2022, when the wars had stopped, and I felt it was time for me to try and do something different.
That's a long time. Is there one takeaway you could give our listeners? Most people have not seen the inner machinations of Congress and how complex it is, and how frustrating I would imagine it can be. But can you just give a little bit of insight on how that works for people?
I absolutely. I'd be happy to. It's not what you see on television, which is unfortunate, because people have an expectation and it's wrong. And defense is really different in the Congress. It is a bipartisan effort. I had very close relationships with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I was in the minority, the majority, the minority, and the majority in the House of Representatives. So I ran the place, and I also was subject to the guys that were running the place. And I would say that on the Armed Services Committee, the staff and the members work together. There is an understanding that they cannot abdicate their responsibility. They have to provide for the service members. They have to provide for the nation's defense. And so that work was holding hearings, doing oversight, which meant going out to military bases, talking to military members, talking to family members, going to Iraq. Went 20 times to Iraq and Afghanistan, trying to make certain that what we were hearing and what we were seeing were the same thing. And where we saw opportunities to make investments that would help the department, or fix things that were wrong with policy, or provide for service members or their families, we would do that. And we did that with the National Defense Authorization Act, which is an annual bill that authorizes, I guess this year, over $800 billion, but it also includes all of the policy changes in law that are necessary for the department to operate. And that ranges from service member pay, all the way through how many ships and planes are we going to buy. And so it's a very all-encompassing piece of legislation, and it was very rewarding. It was very frustrating. Every day I'd go in and there would be some kind of problem, and it didn't matter whether I was in the majority or the minority. We had to figure out a way to get that bill. It took a year to do each one. You start in February and end sometime around Christmas. And we had to figure out a way how we were going to solve all the problems and get past all of the political problems that are being generated to produce a bill that would then give direction to the services. And the thing I would say that's most interesting and people are always fascinated by is members of Congress, when the cameras are off and the doors are closed, are trying to get to solutions. And they're trying to get to solutions, especially with regard to national security, regardless of party. And the staffs that work on those committees are just dedicated people. I was honored to work with the professional people that I worked with, and many of them were retired service members or former service members, but not all. And there were often times when I would sit at a table with my colleagues, and I might be the only one of my party, but no one could tell. None of the people we talked to would know who's the Republican and who's the Democrat. Sometimes you'd hear them ask that question. We didn't care.
Right.
We cared about doing right for the country and trying to overcome the political obstacles that are being put in place by the larger political forces at work.
We've got National POW MIA Day, and what's it mean to you? You've got a little bit of a different take on it based on your service with JTF full accounting. Service members have a different take just based on having served and that sort of thing, but you're closer to the problem and in many regards very close to solutions or part of solutions.
I was a child during the Vietnam War. I watched the war on television. I didn't know anybody, no one in my family. I have a big family. They didn't get drafted. I didn't know anybody who had served. I had no connection to the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And then I went to crash sites, and I found remains, and I walked on the ground, and I went to the Ia Drang Valley, and I went to the borders and areas, and I walked on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And I would say that war became very personal, and in a way that's really, I think, different from those who served in it. I walked away with an incredible respect. I was in the jungle. No one was trying to kill me.
Right.
And it was hard. It was hard. There were a lot of problems. And I walked away with incredible respect for people who served there. I had it before, but I had it in a different way. And the war became very personal. And I can go to Vietnam Memorial now and see names and know those people.
Yeah.
And I didn't before.
Right. Thank you, Paul, and thanks to everyone for joining us for our September Inspiring Stories of Service. Head to our website, nationalvmm.org, where you can access our stories page to read more inspiring stories of veterans. Today, remember to take a moment to honor our veterans and service members who were held captive and returned, as well as those who are still missing. Thanks so much.
Throughout our 120 years, Ford has supported our nation's armed forces and honored their selfless service to our country. The Central Ohio Ford dealers are proud to continue this tradition by investing in the work of the National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus. Together, we want to share the veterans' heroic stories and introduce a grateful nation to the faces behind our forces. Please join us monthly to hear inspiring educational stories from our veterans who have gone above and beyond their call to defend freedom around the world. The National Veterans Memorial and Museum and your Central Ohio Ford dealers. Together, we will never forget.